I've been buying and playing synthesizers now for over 30 years. So why is it that now is the time that I'm finally getting my very first Moog? And there's several reasons for that I want to talk about today. One of them that I know that is on your mind is probably price. And I'm going to get into that, but there's actually several different reasons. So if we go back in time to 1990, that's when I bought my very first real synthesizer. 1990 actually coincides with a time frame when Moog really wasn't making synthesizers. In fact, if my sources are correct, Moog didn't manufacture and sell any new synthesizers bearing the Moog name from 1988 to 2001. So 2002 was the first year that they released a new synthesizer in quite a while, and that would have been the Moog Voyager. And at that time, the Voyager was retailing for, I believe, between $2,900 and $3,500 US. And that's not something that I could really afford at that time. In 2002, I was busy raising a family, and I didn't have as much money to afford synthesizers or music gear in general. I was really into the guitar a lot more during that time frame. I think somewhere around that time might be whenever I got a Triton LE, and that was more than enough of a synthesizer for me that could meet my needs for quite a while. Also at that time, I was doing some experimentation with DAW recording, recording in the computer, and I was trying to use software synthesizers, which at that time really weren't the best quality, I had to admit, but I thought that they might be good enough to suit my needs, using a MIDI controller with those soft synths. So as the years went by, and I thought about Moog from time to time, of course I would see those very expensive synthesizers, like the Voyager. I don't know exactly what year they came out with the first Moog Model D reissue, but as a fan of Rush, the Model D is something that I've been very interested in, but it's pricey. Usually I see those things selling new for around $5,000 US. And now as a Rush fan, when they came out recently with the Geddy Lee edition, of course I was really interested in that, and I still am. I may end up buying one, but I don't know. What would happen typically is I would go into a music store and I would see a Moog synthesizer, for example, the Moog Sub 37, and then later the subsequent 37 that came after that, and they look really interesting. They look like they're really well made, and I really like the sound of those. Every time I played one, I thought that they sounded great. But I think a lot of times when I would get ready to pull the trigger, either they weren't in stock that day, or there was usually, more often than not, some other choice that just made more sense to me at the time. Maybe I wanted something that was polyphonic, because at the time, I really struggled with the idea of having a monophonic synthesizer, a synthesizer that could only play one note at a time, or two notes, like paraphonic, 2 or 3 notes. It just didn't make sense to me, the value of those types of devices, when I had so many other polyphonic options out there. Some of the synthesizers that I bought when I didn't choose a Moog would have been like the Novation Ultranova. When I did finally decide that I wanted an actual monosynth, I got the Novation Base Station, and then in more recent years I got a Sequential Pro 3. So those are the other main monophonic synthesizers that I have that are not software synths. Last summer I did pick up an MFB Synth 2 while I was visiting the 5G store in Tokyo, Japan, but that's really more of a vintage synthesizer that, you know, I probably am not going to play all that often. Now, I did actually own a couple of Moog soft synthesizers. I still have them on my iPad that I don't use very often, but it was it's the Model D and the Moog, and then later the Moog Z, which I do think sound very good, but what we're talking about here is hardware. The times that I did play on a Moog, I did think that they sounded really good. I did have a chance to play in person a couple of times the Moog Matriarch, and I thought that I would really be blown away by that synthesizer because it has a stereo filter, you know, stereo analog filter, and when I actually got my hands on it though and played it, it didn't really impress me quite as much as I thought it would. And again, there was probably some other synthesizer that I just wanted a little bit more at the time that I was thinking of buying one of those. When I played a Model D in person, I really was impressed by the sound. And so for just a moment, I want to talk about analog versus digital. I know there's a huge debate about that, and I'm not here to tell you that I think that analog is better than digital or digital is better than analog. I am a critical thinker, and that means that I really value scientific data when it comes to saying that something sounds better than something else. That's not really something that you can usually prove scientifically. You know, I don't believe in woo or superstition or anything like that. So when it comes to sound, it's subjective, and I do think that in a mix, or even on something like YouTube, it would be really, really difficult for most people to be able to distinguish between the sound of a digital synthesizer and an analog synthesizer. All I can tell you is this: when I'm in my studio right here, I like the sound. First of all, I like the sound of hardware synthesizers significantly better than the sound of software synthesizers. I don't know why that is. Part of that might have to do with some coloration that comes from the circuitry that's inside the preamps. I figure that those resistors and capacitors and diodes that are inside those preamps, particularly older preamps, like I've got, you know, the JD990 that I talk about in other videos. I've even got this old Roland JX10 and JP8000, and a new addition to my studio is the Roland JD800 that I got very, very recently. I can't objectively tell you why I like the sound of those instruments better, but I just do. Again, that's whenever I've got headphones on and I'm listening to them direct in the studio without other instruments playing at the same time, generally, or through my speakers. But the point is that they're live and they're played in person, and I really love the sound. And I don't know exactly why. And if you recorded those sounds and put them side by side with software synthesizers, I imagine that there wouldn't be any way in a mix that I could tell the difference. And at that point, I would like them both the same. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because, you know, Moog is analog. They're hardware synthesizers. And I do like the analog sound. So talking about digital hardware versus analog hardware, again, there's just some reason, maybe because it's a little bit more lo-fi. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but I like the sound of analog over digital. I've got several really, really good digital synthesizers that are hardware based, like the ASM Hydrasynth, for example, that I think sounds amazing, but when I compare it side by side with an analog, I just prefer the analog a little bit more, and that's just my preference. Let's talk about price some more. I think probably most of you know by now, or if you don't, that in 2023, the large parent company in music, which is also the company that owns Akai and other big brands in music, they purchased Moog. And I don't want to get into the politics or the ethics, behind that decision, but what it does mean, right or wrong, that some Moogs are manufactured now overseas, and that means that for the consumer, that those particular instruments you can get at a lower price. So at the time this video was recorded, I picked up the Moog Messenger for $699 US, and I just felt like the time was right. Okay, now there aren't any other synthesizers that are on my radar currently, and the price is right. So I decided to go ahead and get one. It was a somewhat impulsive decision, but I have been interested in Moog for a number of years. So judging it for just what it is, not thinking about where it's made or anything like that, or the price, just for what it is, I feel like it's a very good build quality. The main surface area, I believe, is metal of some kind, and the pitch and mod wheels, they feel every bit as firm as other Moogs that I've tried. The knobs don't feel wobbly at all. They're very, very smooth. The filter is smooth, the keys feel really nice, and the aftertouch is very responsive. I think this is a good time for me to point out that this video is not sponsored, and so I'm not making any money at all from this video at the time that it was recorded. So this is just my opinion here. But yeah, the keys feel nice. And also, for a little bit of additional background, I have owned now 30 synthesizers, including this one. 30 synthesizers with keys, so that doesn't include groove boxes, drum machines, or guitar synthesizers. This is number 30. And so I'm comparing it to all the other synthesizers that I've owned, plus other synthesizers that I've played over the years. And yeah, this is something that based on the short time that I've owned it, that I think it's high enough quality that if I was a touring musician in a band, that I would take this out. If it was something that I needed in my songs, I would feel very comfortable taking this out on tour. And it's got a lot of really great features. After I bought the Sequential Pro 3, I told myself that I would never buy any synthesizer that has less than 3 oscillators. But this has the 2 oscillators plus the sub oscillator. So in a sense, you could say that that's 3 oscillators. But it also creates very complex sounds in different ways with different feedback. I don't want to get into every single feature here. That's not what this video is about. You can find a lot of other YouTube videos out there that demonstrate the sounds and go through all the features a lot better than I could do that for you today. So just in general, you can do a lot of different things with those sounds, and the sequencer allows you to do a lot of different things to make it where it's just not a straight up sequencer with ordinary notes, but you can change things around, and you can do complex things with the modulation. And one thing in particular that I really love is the res bass compensation button on this thing. The resonance bass compensation really makes a huge difference in the way the filter sounds. I mean, I had to turn it down while I was listening with headphones because I thought that I was going to blow my headphones. And with speakers, it would probably even be more so. So you got to be careful with that. Of course, in a recording situation, you usually don't want that much bass because then you're going to reduce the overall volume of your mix so that the trebles and the mid ranges aren't going to be at a loud enough level if you overwhelm things with the bass. And that brings me to the whole idea of a monosynth. You know, like I talked about before, why would I need a monosynth? Well, I don't think you need one, you know, but where they're really good is whenever you want to limit the number of notes that you're playing when the sound itself is really complex. Because if you start adding too many notes, so if you got a polyphonic synth and each individual note is really complex, that can make it where your mix rapidly gets muddy. And if you want to use this in conjunction, any monosynth, in conjunction with other instruments in a mix, a lot of times it's really good whenever you're just playing one note at a time. It's also really good sometimes whenever you're not stereo, because this is not a stereo instrument. It plays out only in a single channel. And that also will help the instrument sit in a mix better in a lot of situations. You know, those old recordings that maybe a lot of you listened to back, you know, in the days of vinyl, they often had only like 8 tracks to work with. And so most of your tracks were in mono. And that's why, in a lot of cases, you can hear the individual instruments better because they have their own specific place. You might pan them somewhat left or somewhat to the right. And of course, you can add effects to make them stereo. But if you leave them in mono, they can sit really, really well in a mix in their own specific space without everything getting all cluttered up in the audio field. Also, whenever you are dealing with bass, this is not just a bass instrument. You know, you can do leads with it. You can cover the whole frequency spectrum, but if you are doing bass, in most cases, producers and mixing engineers will place that sound in the center because the low frequencies really don't separate all that well in the stereo field. You don't have to do that, you know, but I'm just saying that that would be a more common practice. So it doesn't really matter as much that the instrument is monophonic and in mono both. So do I regret not buying a Moog sooner? A little bit, yeah. I think that if I would have got a sub 37, for example, I would have really enjoyed using that. I would have learned a lot about sound design. I mean, that's a lot more complex than this is. You know, it would have been a purchase that I don't think I would have regretted at all. Also, do I think that I'm going to get any more Moog instruments after this one? And the answer is probably yes. I probably will. You know, I don't know if I'm going to go with some of the smaller form factor type things that they offer, you know, in the small, almost modular-like size that you've probably seen. Like the drummer from Another Mother and some of those devices that are about that size. Would I consider getting a Moog Muse? Yes, I would definitely consider that. It's just, you know, right now I've got so many different synthesizers in my studio. Plus I do really like to use software synthesizers a lot. I'm not just a hardware guy. I'm not just a DAW-less guy. So I've got so many to choose from already that, you know, I don't know what I'm going to buy in the future, but I'm generally very careful about the decisions I make now. I usually want to buy something that's different than the things that I already have. I mentioned earlier that I have the Novation Bass Station, and that sounds really, really good. So why would I buy this when this is actually very similar to that? Well, it's because it does have its own sound. The sequencer is different, the filter is different, the sound of the basic oscillators is different. This has a richness to it, a character. People who have used Moogs know this already, so I'm preaching to the choir here. But it's definitely different than a Novation Bass Station. It's way different than a Sequential Pro 3. The Pro 3 has even more amazing features that you can use with its sequencer, but the oscillators are much more thin until you really work at them. You have to really pump them up. And that's maybe a topic for another video. The Pro 3, I really do like it for what it is, but it's not this. They are different. Another consideration that I have is that, you know, I told you that I've been collecting synthesizers since 1990. So that means I'm not a young man, and I do kind of think about the future sometimes. I think about, you know, is it always going to be where I have so much room? I mean, things have changed in my life over the years, where I told you that I did have a family. I still have a family, but I am no longer married, and my girlfriend and partner has her own home, and my children have grown up and moved on, so I've got a fairly sizable house that's all to myself. So I've got lots of room for synthesizers of any size in my home right now, not just in this small studio, but in other rooms. You know, I can put things anywhere I want to, so space isn't a problem, but maybe someday it will be. So that's another reason why I'm buying some smaller synthesizers like this, because there might be a day where I do need to downsize. You know, we just have to be real about things. I don't want to be down to the point where I'm only relying on software synthesizers no matter how good they get. And again, I do like them and I do use them, but I think I'm always going to want to have some hardware around, because it just inspires you to create in a completely different way when you can turn multiple knobs at the same time. And who doesn't like to play the filter? Yeah, I know you can use external controllers to play the filter on your software synth. I really love it when the filter is located such that I can use my thumb, so that while I'm playing, I can do filter sweeps with my thumb in real time. And then you can make it where you're doing multiple knobs at the same time, or you put it on hold. You just get around so much quicker with hardware. And I think that this is probably going to be one of those synthesizers that I keep for a really long time. I can't say for sure. I really don't sell synthesizers that often now, because I've learned that if you sell a synthesizer, then there's a good chance that even if you haven't used it in a couple of years, you may miss it. And so because of that, now whenever I buy a hardware synthesizer, my intention is I'm going to keep it until selling it is a necessity for some reason, whether it be a financial necessity or a space necessity. So another reason why I might sell a synthesizer is if I'm really not playing it and I think that I'm giving it to somebody or passing it along to somebody who's going to use it a lot more than I did. You know, that would be another really good reason to pass one along. So anyway, those are my thoughts about the Moog Messenger. I'd really be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments, whether you agree or disagree with me about the analog versus digital, or if you think there's other Moogs that you recommend that I try, or maybe you have similar experiences of why you did or didn't buy a Moog synthesizer yourself. I respect your opinion, and I'd really like to hear it. So thank you for watching this video, and I hope you have a great day.